How the Fukushima disaster cost Japan $200 billion. A wave, then a power outage, then a very simple problem. No electricity means no cooling. No cooling means the fuel inside a nuclear reactor starts to heat up on its own with nothing stopping it. That's really the entire story. Not an explosion out of nowhere. A backup generator sitting in a basement that got flooded before it could do its one job. Here's what that flooded basement ended up costing. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the northeastern coast of Japan, the largest ever recorded in the country's history. It triggered a tsunami with waves reaching higher than 40 feet in some locations. The earthquake and tsunami combined killed somewhere between 16,000 and 19,500 people, most of them drowned by the wave itself, not by anything that happened afterward at a power plant. Hold that number in your head for a moment. Almost everyone who died that day died from the water, not the reactor. What happened next at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is a completely separate, much stranger story. One about money rather than a body count. The plant's reactors shut down automatically the instant the earthquake hit, exactly as designed. That part worked. The problem was what came next. Nuclear fuel doesn't stop generating heat the moment a reactor shuts down. It needs active cooling for days afterward, and that cooling needs electricity. The plant's main power was knocked out by the earthquake. Its backup diesel generators, which were supposed to take over immediately, were housed in low-lying areas of the site. The tsunami arrived less than an hour later and flooded them completely. With both primary and backup power gone, the cooling systems for 3 separate reactors, units 1, 2, and 3, failed within hours of each other. Fuel inside began to overheat, melt, and react with its own zirconium cladding, producing hydrogen gas that built up inside the reactor buildings with nowhere to vent. Over the following 4 days, hydrogen explosions tore through the outer structures of 3 separate reactor buildings, one after another, blowing their roofs off on live television and releasing radioactive material into the surrounding area, plant workers and emergency crews racing against a countdown clock they had never trained for, using backup equipment, including car batteries, scavenged from the plant's own parking lot to try to get instrument readings back online. Here's the detail worth sitting with. This was not a design nobody had thought about. Engineers and regulators had discussed the tsunami risk to this exact plant for years before 2011. The site's seawall was built to handle a wave of about 19 feet. The wave that hit was more than twice that height in places. A safety margin, calculated years in advance, simply wasn't large enough for the day it actually mattered. Now, the death toll question, and this is where Fukushima becomes genuinely strange to talk about. As of the most recent studies, there have been 0 confirmed deaths directly caused by radiation exposure from the accident itself. Not one. No one has died of acute radiation sickness. No confirmed radiation-linked cancer deaths have been definitively attributed to the accident, though some models estimate a small statistical possibility of additional cancers over the coming decades. Numbers so low, they're genuinely difficult to distinguish from Japan's ordinary background cancer rate. Researchers at Stanford, modeling the radiation dose data more aggressively than most official estimates, put together a range suggesting anywhere from 15 to 1,300 potential deaths from direct radiation exposure over time, settling on a best estimate of roughly 130 plus another 180 from radiation-linked cancer, figures still small enough in a country of over 120 million people to be statistically almost invisible, and figures that remain genuinely disputed among researchers who study this kind of long-tail radiation exposure for a living. But there is a second number, official and undisputed, and it tells a very different story. Japan's government has confirmed 2,313 what it calls disaster-related deaths among the people evacuated from Fukushima Prefecture. Deaths from the stress, disruption, and physical toll of the evacuation itself. Elderly patients who died being moved out of hospitals and nursing homes during the chaotic evacuation. People who died from the health consequences of losing their homes, their routines, and their communities all at once. The radiation didn't kill them. The evacuation, in a very real sense, arguably did. Roughly 160,000 people were evacuated from the area around the plant in total. More than a decade later, over 100,000 of them still have not been able to return home, kept out by government restrictions on radiation exposure that remain in place today. Let's build out where the money actually went because, like every disaster in this series, the total didn't arrive as a single bill. Start with decommissioning, the actual physical job of shutting the wrecked plant down for good. Japan's government first estimated this at approximately 2 trillion yen, roughly $17.5 billion back in 2013. By 2016, that estimate had quadrupled to approximately 8 trillion yen, close to $75 billion, as officials got a clearer look at just how difficult removing melted nuclear fuel from 3 separate reactor cores was actually going to be. The work is expected to take another 30 to 40 years to finish. Some of the technology required to safely remove the melted fuel didn't exist when the accident happened. Parts of it still don't fully exist today. Then there's compensation, the payments made directly to the people and businesses harmed by the accident, farmers who couldn't sell contaminated produce, business owners forced to abandon their shops inside the evacuation zone, families displaced from homes they may never return to. TEPCO, the utility that operated the plant, estimated its own compensation liability at more than 5 trillion yen by 2014, about $50 billion. By 2015, the company's own rehabilitation plan put that figure at approximately 7.08 trillion yen, roughly $57 billion, with the Japanese government stepping in yet again to provide fresh public funding, the 8th separate round of assistance TEPCO had required by that point. Then there's decontamination, the actual physical work of scrubbing radioactive material out of soil, buildings, and roads across a wide area of Fukushima prefecture. Japanese research institutes estimated this cost at somewhere between 2.5 and 5.1 trillion yen, roughly $25 to $51 billion, plus an additional 1.6 trillion yen, about $14 billion, just to build storage facilities for the contaminated soil that decontamination work generates. That soil has to go somewhere. Decades later, much of it still sits in temporary storage because nobody has agreed on a permanent location willing to accept it. Added up the way Japan's own Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry eventually had to. By 2016, the government's official total estimate for the disaster had reached approximately 21.5 trillion yen, close to $188 billion, roughly double what officials had projected just 3 years earlier in 2013. By some slightly later government estimates, that number crossed $200 billion outright. To put that in perspective, $200 billion is roughly what it would cost to buy Coca-Cola, one of the most recognizable companies on the planet, outright in a single transaction. Here's where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because that $200 billion figure is the conservative one. It's the number that shows up in official government accounting, and it almost certainly understates the true economic damage. A peer-reviewed literature review published in 2019 found that once you account for the full range of published cost estimates, total accident costs could plausibly exceed $500 billion. Some independent economic analyses that attempt to account for indirect effects, lost agricultural exports, lost tourism, the economic value of land inside the exclusion zone sitting unused for decades, and a measurable, well-documented drop in Japanese automotive exports tied to a broader loss of confidence following the disaster, have suggested the true total economic toll could approach $700 billion, possibly more. Different institutions, different methodologies, different assumptions about how far the ripple effects of a single accident actually extend. Every single one of them lands somewhere between a very large number and a genuinely staggering one. There's a smaller number buried inside all of this that deserves its own mention, because it's a familiar shape by now if you've watched other videos in this series. Japan's Board of Audit reported in 2013 that approximately 23% of the government's disaster recovery funding, about 1.45 trillion yen, roughly $14.5 billion, had been misappropriated. Not stolen in the sense of simple theft, but redirected. Investigators found hundreds of funded projects with no direct connection whatsoever to the earthquake, tsunami, or nuclear accident at all, riding along on a budget category that was supposed to be reserved exclusively for disaster recovery. A pandemic relief program half a world away and a decade later would end up losing money to fraud for strikingly similar reasons. When a government moves enormous sums of money quickly under enormous public pressure to be seen doing something, the oversight almost never moves at the same speed as the money. There's a cost still accumulating today that most people outside Japan barely heard about. The plant generates contaminated cooling water constantly, and by the early 2020s, TEPCO had run out of space to store it, more than 1,000 large storage tanks covering the site, holding over 1 million tons of treated water. In 2023, after years of filtering to remove most radioactive isotopes and dilution to bring remaining tritium levels well below international safety thresholds, Japan began releasing that treated water into the Pacific Ocean, a process expected to continue for roughly 30 years. The decision triggered an immediate diplomatic and economic reaction. China banned all seafood imports from Japan in response, a market worth several $100 million annually to Japanese fishing exporters, only partially lifting the ban more than a year later. Japan's government committed several $100 million in additional support to fishing communities, specifically to offset the reputational and market damage of a release that international nuclear regulators had signed off on as safe, a reminder that a portion of this disaster's cost isn't physics or engineering at all. It's the ongoing price of public trust that was lost in the first few days of March 2011 and has never fully been rebuilt since. TEPCO itself became a case study in what happens to a company judged too important to be allowed to fail. The Japanese government effectively nationalized the utility in 2012, injecting roughly 1 trillion yen in public funds in exchange for a majority equity stake, keeping the company's lights on specifically so it could continue functioning as the vehicle for paying compensation and funding decommissioning work for decades to come. TEPCO's stock price collapsed by more than 80% in the year following the accident. Executives faced a criminal trial. 3 former TEPCO executives were formally charged with professional negligence over the disaster, though they were ultimately acquitted in criminal court in 2019, a verdict that a separate civil court later effectively contradicted in 2022 by ordering 4 former executives to pay TEPCO itself approximately 13 trillion yen, roughly $95 billion, in damages, the largest damages award in Japanese corporate history, in a shareholder lawsuit arguing the company's own leadership had failed to adequately prepare for a tsunami risk the company had known about for years. What did the world get in exchange for a bill this size? Fukushima fundamentally rewrote nuclear safety standards worldwide in a way that echoes what happened after Chernobyl a quarter-century earlier, but with its own specific lessons. Nuclear regulators across dozens of countries ordered immediate reviews of flood and tsunami risk at every coastal nuclear plant under their authority. Backup power systems at nuclear plants worldwide were required to be moved to higher ground or made watertight or given additional redundant backups entirely separate from the original system, closing the precise vulnerability that doomed Fukushima specifically. Germany, in direct response to the accident, announced a complete phase-out of nuclear power entirely, shutting down its last operating reactors in 2023, a policy shift German economists have since estimated cost the country tens of billions of dollars in replacement power generation and accelerated grid investment, expenses that trace their origin not to any incident on German soil, but to a wave that hit a Japanese coastline thousands of miles away. Japan itself shut down every single one of its 54 nuclear reactors in the aftermath, and even now, more than a decade later, only a fraction of them have been permitted to restart, each one only after extensive new safety upgrades and public hearings that didn't exist before 2011. Put the whole story side by side. A wave, arriving less than an hour after an earthquake, found the one vulnerability nobody had built high enough walls to stop: a set of backup generators sitting in a basement built to handle a flood that turned out to be roughly half the size of the one that actually came. Officially, that flooded basement cost Japan approximately $200 billion. Unofficially, once you account for the exclusion zone, the lost exports, and the decades of decontamination work still ongoing today, the real number may be several times higher than that. 0 people died from the radiation itself. Thousands died anyway, from the disruption of trying to keep them safe from it. Fukushima did not happen because nuclear power is inherently too dangerous to operate near an ocean. It happened because a safety margin, calculated years in advance by people doing their best with the information available at the time, was built for a wave that was smaller than the one that eventually came, and the world has been paying the difference between those two numbers, in yen, in dollars, and in decades of decommissioning work ever since.
Hi guys, welcome to my video. Please keep in mind that everything is in this video is fictional and contains predictions. I produce all the videos on this channel by myself. It means a lot to me. If you like the video and leave comments, thank you. Enjoy the video.